Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 19th of June 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish.
Well, we're going to start off with the G20, Brian, and that takes place towards the end of next week. I think it's Friday and Saturday next week. But, the question is, are people wondering why the war rhetoric is ramping up, over Iran just at the moment? And also this business of cyber attacks against Russia that we were talking about on Monday's program. So certainly the Russians and the Chinese seem to be believing that this is related to the G20 and the fact that Trump has made it clear that he wants to do deals with Russia and China, while the US deep state has also made it clear that they don't want to do deals with China and Russia. So this is coming next week. Trump, day before yesterday, had a very good telephone conversation with President Xi of China. We will be having an extended meeting next week at the G20 in Japan. Our respective teams will begin talks prior to our meeting. President Xi said that the difficulties that the US and China had recently are not in the interest of either side. Both countries gain from cooperation and lose from confrontation. Both should push forward the China-US relationship on the basis of mutual respect and mutual benefit. Now, unfortunately, that kind of rhetoric is not what we're seeing between the United States and Russia, or between Britain and Russia for that matter. And if you remember, recently Putin had made the point that interests in economic and social spheres and global security are more important than spy games. London should leave all that trivia aside and do business. Will Theresa May be doing any business? Because she is expected to meet Putin at the G20 meeting, but not Donald Trump, it seems. And this is TASS here referencing a Commerzant article, Putin-Trump meeting in limbo due to the New York Times leak on US hacker attacks. So they're saying ahead of the G20 summit in Japan's Osaka, which is expected to host a meeting between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, the US has been ramping up its online attacks against Russia's power grid. The New York Times has reported sources say that the hackers' attacks are intended as a warning to Moscow against the alleged efforts to meddle in the 2020 presidential campaign. So this is, regurgitating the same old nonsense. They said that a similar situation occurred a year ago ahead of the Helsinki summit between the two presidents, when the American media reported on Russia's alleged hacker attacks against the US power grid. As a rule, such stories about hackers resonate widely, and it's almost impossible to either confirm or deny them. That's why the best tool for creating a background for a new confrontation. And that was a quote from the director of the Franklin Roosevelt US Policy Studies Center in Moscow State University. Both China and Russia then have issued strong warnings against the attacks, or at least the allegations against Iran. Sergei Lavrov saying we must demand that all parties show restraint and refrain from any harsh actions, especially following the same highly likely logic that the West used in many other cases. Well, of course, that highly likely logic that he's talking about is exactly the language that Harriet Baldwin was using at the EU Foreign Affairs Council meeting that we covered on Monday's programme. She used the language almost certain. It was almost certain that Iran was responsible. I'm not quite sure how you can be almost certain. You're either certain or you're not. But anyway, Lavrov said those who rely on inciting tension between Arabs and Persians, Arabs and Kurds, and inside the Arab world between Sunnis and Shiites are not guided by the interests of the people of the region, but by their own narrow geopolitical motives. And then the Pentagon had released, well, this is the Minister of the US Department of Defense website, US working to build international consensus on Gulf of Oman incident, Shanahan says. This international consensus, of course, is the rapid response mechanism that Theresa May organised at the G7 meeting in June last year. The idea of a consensus, attribution of blame, and a consensus across all the G7 nations as a result. So the US working to build that consensus at the moment. They then released 12 new photographs yesterday, again, apparently showing Iranian responsibility, they claim, for the attacks on the tankers in the Persian Gulf. According to the Associated Press, these images were supposedly Iranian forces removing the unexploded mine. Now, of course, that was originally in video form, but they've produced still photographs of that now. Then Mr. Shanahan himself released a statement, from Acting Secretary of Defense Patrick Shanahan on additional forces to US Central Command. And so he said that the recent Iranian attacks validated the reliable, credible intelligence we've received on hostile behavior by Iranian forces and their proxy groups that threaten United States personnel and interests across the region. The United States does not seek conflict with Iran. The action today is being taken to ensure the safety and welfare of our military personnel working throughout the region and to protect our national interests. And what is the action that they've taken? Another 1,000 US troops heading out to the Gulf to support what's already there. Now, what's interesting is that no sooner had he made that announcement, or at least within 24 hours, and he resigned. So Patrick M. Shanahan saying, it has been a deep honour and privilege to serve our country alongside the men and women of the Department of Defence. I would welcome the opportunity to be Secretary of Defence, but not at the expense of being a good father. After significant reflection, I've asked to be withdrawn from consideration for Secretary of Defence and will resign my position as Deputy Secretary of Defence. I will coordinate an appropriate transition plan, and so on. So while Russia and China seem to be believing that the reason for the escalation of all this stuff right now is in an effort to subvert Trump's intention to speak to Putin and to Xi, nonetheless, the US deep state building up what's going on in the Middle East at the moment, but apparently Patrick Shanahan at least doesn't want to be part of it.
Yeah, interesting, isn't it? I'll just come back to that statement that if we had the US attacking Russian infrastructure by cyber means or whatever it is, this is an act of war.
Yes.
And if the Americans were accusing, as they have been, of the Russians of interfering, that would actually, if true, be an act of war. So America should be in the position of calming this whole situation down. Instead, we're seeing escalation in a tit-for-tat thing. And of course, we're certainly seeing an escalation around Iran. The rhetoric is all for it. The truth movements are all for it. But in Western press, UK press, we're not getting any proper analysis of just how dangerous this is and what these people are really trying to do, the US.
That's right. And just to remind everybody, of course, one of the really key features of that New York Times article that was published at the weekend was the fact that they were citing Bolton as being the source of this information, and Bolton bragging that he hadn't informed Trump that this was going on. So you're
bragging that you haven't informed your president, right, of serious information. Well, we'll say the information is serious, but you're bragging that you haven't informed your own president.
Right.
This shows the fractions inside the American administration, Mike, doesn't it? And it shows how dangerous it is, because do we really know who is actually running the United States at the moment?
No, is the answer, I think.
No.
Now, Theresa May, of course, as I said, is going to be meeting President Putin at the G20, but who else has she been meeting? Well, on the left here, we've got Ashraf Ghani, who is the president of Afghanistan. So they held a bilateral meeting on Monday. Ashraf Ghani, sorry. They discussed the upcoming presidential election in Afghanistan and agreed that these have to be credible and transparent. No Russian interference, I'm sure, was on the table there. On regional stability, the Prime Minister welcomed the steps towards peace in Afghanistan that President Ghani has taken, as well as his talks with Prime Minister Khan of Pakistan. So this is all fantastic stuff. And they also discussed the UK's continued development assistance for Afghanistan, so that's good. And on the right, we have Ivan Duque, who's the president of Colombia. They began by recognising the close trade links between the UK and Colombia and agreed on the need to increase opportunities, particularly in the creative, clean energy and fintech sectors. So that's good news too. They discussed the situation in Venezuela and they also spoke about the importance of tackling climate change. So I was wondering what's sort of behind these meetings coming at this time. I'm wondering, is it the upcoming publication of the latest UN World Drugs Report? Because, of course, these two countries' major drug manufacturers, which is this report normally published towards the second half of June. So we're expecting that imminently. Or was it perhaps because her successor, whomever that might be, is likely to be an admitted user of opium or Colombian marching powder, and she wants to make sure that a suitable supply is available as part of her legacy? I'll leave it to viewers and listeners to decide which of those is the likeliest scenario.
At that point, I have to take a pause. Mike, we're often telling our audience that we're finding it increasingly difficult to report what is the news because it's so bizarre. But yep, that's the truth of the matter. We know that drugs have been used in Westminster, almost certainly still are. That's been widely reported in the press. And we've got people admitting the use of drugs. These are the people running the country. We should be very concerned. But it gets worse. So let's switch to this. Now, back in October 2015, the UK column was warning that a local Conservative MP, Oliver Colville, was showing an unnatural interest in hedgehogs. And this is part of a number of reports that we did on this, because, of course, there are many, many other subjects which require the attentions of MPs over and above hedgehogs. But this is one of the images that he tweeted out. It might have been on his Facebook. I think it was a Twitter image. There were reports on his website, how I'm voting in the upcoming European referendum, pharmacy, the National Hedgehog Campaign. So this was very, very important. We said at the time we'd got fraudulent banks collapsing, we got the UK borders open, we've got the US and the UK driving terror in Syria, we got paedophiles in Westminster, but what is this Conservative MP focusing on? Hedgehogs. And he said at the time that this was partly because he remembered his mummy's, his words, his mummy's stories about, bedtime stories about hedgehogs. We said, is this a sign of breakdown or is it something else going on? But let's follow through. The reports continued, and this is him talking about meeting with individuals very concerned about animals. We said we've got an EU dictatorship coming, but don't worry because Oliver Colville was on the case discussing the matter of hedgehogs. This is the Western Morning News. West Country MP ridiculed for bid to make hedgehog UK national symbol. So the British lion should be replaced with a hedgehog, according to this man. And you're, of course, laughing, Mike. But this is very, very serious stuff because either it's a breakdown or it's a reversion to some form of childish intellect. And has that been imposed? He said his love of hedgehogs stemmed from his mother reading Beatrice Potter's The Tale of Miss Tiggywinkle to him as a child. And this is the man at the time tasked as Defence Committee Secretary in reporting on the UK nuclear submarine industry. We were concerned, but it went on. And then we noticed some connections. Great debate on hedgehogs this evening. Thanks to everyone who came along and supported, especially the @Rory Stewart UK. So
don't forget the word excellent, the excellent @Rory Stewart UK.
Yes, excellent @Rory Stewart UK. If you don't know Rory Stewart, this is him in his quasi-Taliban outfit, but this man now is number 2 candidate to become the Prime Minister of Britain. So let's have a look at what Rory Stewart had to say on the subject of hedgehogs.
For this push in intervention, of course, he refers, though, to the Asian variety of the hedgehog, rather than the Western hedgehog, which is the nature of our discussion today. Madam Deputy Speaker, the fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And I am extremely pleased to be here and to have the opportunity to respond to the Honourable Member for Plymouth, Sutton and Devonport, who has introduced this to the House. For the first time, I believe, hedgehogs have been discussed by Parliament since 1566, Madam Deputy Speaker, where hedgehogs were, of course, famously raised in relation to the attribution of a bounty of twopence for the collection of the hedgehog throughout the United Kingdom. Now, it is extremely important to take on board that the hedgehog has gone through an extraordinary evolution. 1566 seems something that was very recent, but of course the hedgehog was around before 1566. The hedgehog was around before this Parliament. The hedgehog and its ancestor narrowly missed being crushed under the foot of Tyrannosaurus rex. The hedgehog was around long before the human species, 56 million years ago.
Well, there you have it. We've saved our audience today because actually that address went on for 13 minutes. Now, I don't know what the cost per minute is of somebody being able to speak in the House mic, but I can imagine that we are talking tens of thousands of pounds. And this is the man who possibly is going to be the next Prime Minister of UK. So what is happening with these people? Is he simply taking the mickey out of the British public as a whole? Is he cocking a snoop at the ordinary working person while he carries out his lavish lifestyle? Has he been brainwashed? Is he having a breakdown? We don't know. But here's the reality, because the BBC announced this in the last couple of days. Hedgehog sign warns drivers of small wildlife hazards. I've labelled this "Get ready for another attack on people's minds." They also have produced a nice little cartoon video, which I hope will play. Should do. Here we go. We're going to improve driver safety and save small wildlife, making our roads safer. And that's going to be done using a warning triangle with a hedgehog inside it. So here is the Department of Transport on gov.uk. New road sign to improve road safety and protect animals. Areas where accident rates are highest could benefit from a new sign which warns of hazards due to animals in the road. And of course, Chris Grayling, I've said alleged Transport Secretary because since he's following this policy, I don't think he's credible as Transport Secretary. But he said, we have some of the safest roads in the world, but we're always looking at how we can make them safer. Motorcyclists and other vulnerable road users are particularly at risk. The new small mammal warning sign should help to reduce the number of people killed and injured, as well as helping our precious small wild mammal population to flourish. Now, we did take the trouble of phoning up the Department of Transport to ask them some questions, and I'll come on to that in a minute. But compare the fact that you're now going to be faced in rural areas with maybe tens of thousands of hedgehog signs. What else is happening in the Department of Transport? Well, you may not be aware of this, but where smart motorways are appearing across the country, they are removing the safety of the hard shoulder because this is becoming an additional lane for cars. And therefore, if you break down on one of the new smart motorways, your car will be stationary in the road, in the path of high-speed traffic. And as a result, there have already been deaths and great consternation between people who have seen this system come in. So we're not addressing the deaths of human beings on smart motorways, but we are following the action by MPs now pushing signs for watching out for hedgehogs. Here's another article on this same subject about the smart motorways and the lack of a hard shoulder, and the AA in particular has been speaking out on this, saying that the removal of hard shoulder on hundreds of miles of road could endanger drivers. Well, it's not could, because it's already demonstrated that it is endangering drivers. We tried to speak to Highways England to see what the latest statistics were about injuries and death on their smart motorways, but despite having what was clearly a smart telephone system, we couldn't actually get a reply. If you're not aware, Highways Agency operates as a PLC, so all of our roads have now been passed into a private control of a private company, where they are simply given one huge slug of money at the beginning of the year to do with as they please. So MPs are not focusing on the rise of tension with Russia and China. They're not focusing on the fact that we can't feed people or look after our elderly. They are focused on hedgehogs. and there's got to be a reason for this. So back to Mr. Chris Grayling. He'd been meeting with road safety experts a couple of days ago, including Break, the AA and the RAC Foundation, together with animal protection groups, including the Wildlife Trust, to discuss the scale of the problem. Between 2005 and 2017, 100 people were killed, with a further 14,173 injured in accidents where an animal was in the road. Now, they were unable to tell us how many people have been killed or injured as a result of hedgehogs. That was one of the things they could tell us. We asked what drivers should do if they saw a hedgehog sign, and they say that drivers should slow down and be vigilant. So I'm interested to know how that will affect driving if you're on perhaps 10 miles of country road and you see that hedgehog sign. Presumably you're going to slow down to 20 miles an hour for the remaining 9 miles, Mike, while looking out for hedgehogs.
Good.
Okay, imposed madness in UK.
Absolutely. Okay, tonight in the George in Plimpton, everybody can come along to the UK Column meeting, and we'll be discussing Twitter. We're given a demonstration of how we use Twitter and how Twitter can be used for activism, so do get along to that if you possibly can. Once again, if you like the work that we're doing here at the UK Column and you'd like to support us, you can do so at ukcolumn.org/community, and there's various ways to help us out there. And just a quick reminder that AV10 DVD is still available at the UK Column website if you'd like to get a box set there.
Okay, well, an update on the David Noakes and Lynn Thayer case, and we are sad to report that on Monday there was yet another court case, which is a step on the path of the British state to extradite Lynn Thayer to face charges in France. Now, remember that this lady had been working with David Noakes to help people with cancer. They'd had tremendous success, but the British government is not interested in successes in dealing with cancer. They're more interested in the fact that if you don't adhere to the licensing, you're going to face time in prison and face double jeopardy with possible prison time in France. So at the court hearing, the judge threw the common law arguments out of court. John Smith, who we've been reporting over the last couple of weeks, was ordered out of the court. I believe the judge at one point threw documents at him, but this of course left the prosecution to simply argue that in order to keep Lynn Thayer safe, she should be arrested, and a warrant for her arrest was duly made. Now, I'm pleased to say that Lynn is at the moment still safe, and she's listening into this broadcast. We're going to say, well done for your bravery, Lynn. Keep going. But of course, it does now mean that police forces across the country are on the lookout for this lady who the British state treats as being a dangerous criminal for trying to help people with cancer. If you'd like to learn more, Ian Crane has put out a number of videos. This one is from yesterday. You can find this on YouTube, where he's making some pretty strong accusations. I'll leave our audience, viewers and listeners, to judge that, but you can see what he says. And many people have said to us, well, where do these judges come from? And I'm going to refer our viewers today back to the UK column. This was from 2 or 3 years ago, where we were saying, well, where do judges come from? And of course, they're appointed by the Judicial Appointments Panel. But if you then ask who appoints the Judicial Appointments Panel, it all goes very, very quiet. And the UK column has not managed to establish which individuals are responsible for appointing people within the Judicial Appointments Panel. So if you can help us with this, we'd be extremely grateful. But of course, the David Noakes and Lynn Thayer case demonstrates that once judges can operate in their own courts, which many people would describe as star chambers, without juries present, then we're in extremely dangerous times.
Okay, good news, Brian. Good news. Apparently, an Israeli company, High Sky, has established a UK limited company, High Sky Sat Limited. It's based in London. It's going to have a research and development centre in Harwell. And it's going to develop a satellite communications network management system and an operations centre. This is part of US Space Agency funded exercise to develop cutting edge space telecoms technology. So of course this is 5G related. So part of the new project is going to integrate and develop 5G networks into their Smartalite satellite receiving terminal and carry out a demonstration of how it can connect seamlessly between different satellites and operators. So this becomes a UK-Israeli operation. Chris Skidmore, the Science Minister, said the UK government's modern industrial strategy and commitment to the European Space Agency are bringing innovative companies like OneWeb, Satisfy and High Sky to Britain. Now this is small scale stuff, I have to say, despite the fact it's 5G related. It's a few £1 million here, a few £1 million there. We should not forget that although the European Space Agency is not an EU agency as such, part of the deal for us getting into the EU in the first place, we had to give up our satellite launch technology. So we remain the only country in the world that has ever developed the capability to launch satellites into orbit and then has just given it up in order to do a deal in order to get into the EU. Yeah. It's pretty pathetic, and now the government trying through its modern industrial strategy to claim that we are going to become the center and the hub of satellite technology going forward. This is nonsense.
Well, maybe we could also say the same about cars. We're going to become a world leader in cars, but we don't actually produce any ourselves.
Well, indeed. Indeed. More good news. Here is Sir Simon Gass. Now, he has been the interim chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. He has now been made permanent chair, or at least he's been given the job fully now. So Sir Mark Sedwill, with the agreement of the Prime Minister, apparently, in other words, he told Theresa May to agree, has announced the appointment of Sir Simon Gass as the new chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. He has been interim chair since February, while on loan from his role as Commandant of the Royal College of Defence Studies. Now, what's his career? Well, he joined the Foreign and Commonwealth Office in '77. He went to Lagos, Athens, back to London. Then he was Assistant Private Secretary to the Foreign Secretary in London. Then he went to Rome. Then he became a councillor at the Foreign Office. Then he became Deputy High Commissioner to South Africa. Director of Resources and Finance at the Foreign Office. Then he went to Greece. He was ambassador to Iran for a couple of years. Then he became NATO Senior Civilian Representative in Afghanistan. And then he became Political Director for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. And he succeeded Mark Sedwill in that role. And he became the Prime Minister's Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And then, as we said, he became Commandant of the Royal College of Defence Studies. And has now been made chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. So what did Mark Sedwill have to say about this? I'm pleased that Simon will be leading the Joint Intelligence Committee permanently. Having done a fine job over the past few months as interim chair, I look forward to continuing to work with them on intelligence and security. And of course, he has been working with them for quite some time. So if anybody has any doubt that Mark Sedwill is consolidating his position by bringing more of his connections into the appropriate jobs, here's more evidence of it. And let's just remember that if Boris Johnson, who is currently leading the leadership contest for the Tory party, is claiming that he is going to build a Brexit cabinet and remove the Remainers from the cabinet, that matters not one jot if he doesn't clean out the Cabinet Office and the officials who have been the people that have actually been doing the job over the last 2 or 3 years. So that's Mark Sedwill in particular, Ollie Robbins and a few others within the Cabinet Office who are clear Remainers. British government or cabinet policy is not going to change until that lot is swapped out for people that are perhaps have slightly more balanced views.
Absolutely correct, Mike. And I'd just like to reinforce for the audience, you mentioned there that Simon Gass You said he was Commandant of the Royal College of Defence Studies, but also Political Director of the Foreign and Commonwealth.
That was a previous role,
That was his previous role,
yes.
Political Director. But of course, if we're dealing Foreign and Commonwealth Office, we should be dealing with the civil service, which should be non-political. And this, of course, is one of the things which has been done in the background. It's a direct attack on the Constitution that party politics has been brought straight into the middle of the civil service. So that would have been a particularly dangerous role for this individual. Well, let's focus again on who we might get for our Prime Minister. This is a Spectator from a day ago. The Brexit Party rallies behind Rory Stewart. This is a very interesting article. Encourage people to go and have a read. It seems like half of Twitter has fallen in love with Rory Stewart and his whirlwind campaign to become Prime Minister. But recently, it's not just centrist swing voters who've been swept off their feet by the International Development Secretary. Certain figures on the pro-no deal side of the Brexit now seem to have fallen under his spell. Nigel Farage invited Stewart onto his LBC show yesterday and hailed him for having, quote, set alight the Tory leadership process and praised his terrific campaign. Mike, what is going on here that this guy has come out of the background and is now being pushed and pushed? Somebody even suggested that they thought that Boris would get it, Boris would become Prime Minister, but after a couple of months something would come up and he would have to step down, and then very gently we would have Rory Stewart stepping into the shoes as Prime Minister. Do you think that's possible?
Well, it's interesting that you say he was second in the rankings. Well, he was, but in last night's vote he ended up coming fourth. So while the public opinion and the bookies were certainly having him in second place, he didn't do as well as it seemed to be. Now that could very well be because all these people are being run by the same campaign management, and so the whole thing is a charade, as we were reporting on Monday's programme. But we've got to remember who is it that is backing Rory Stewart. Absolutely backing Rory Stewart is Kenneth Clarke, and therefore, since, as we said on Monday's programme, Kenneth Clarke is the biggest Remainer in the House of Commons, the biggest Europhile in the House of Commons. Kenneth Clarke would not be backing Rory Stewart unless he is convinced that Rory would be keeping us in the EU. So he has some support. Now what's interesting is that Boris has a lead at the moment, which is so far out ahead that if it would probably take the combined votes of at least 3 out of the 4 of the remaining candidates to offer any serious challenge, to all go to one person. To offer any serious challenge. So at the moment it's still looking like Boris is out ahead, but we have to see.
Okay, well, we'll finish the warning on this man. Thank you for that, Mike. The Guardian here, Rory Stewart calling my constituents yokels was foolish. Tory MP for Penrith and the Borders says he's trying to highlight the issue of poverty. But if you read this article, he was just, well, it was disgraceful. He said some areas around here are pretty primitive, people holding up their trousers with bits of twine and that sort of thing. I was in one village where a local kid was run over by a tractor. They took him to Carlisle, but they couldn't be bothered to wait at the hospital, so they put him in a darkened room for 2 weeks and then said he was fine, but I'm not so sure he was. This is speaking with utter contempt to the ordinary person. We've warned about this man under the Florence of Arabia title. These were some of his positions. So Chair of the Defence Select Committee, Bilderberger, Trilateral Commission, EU Council on Foreign Relations, Turquoise Mountain. This was a slide back in 2014 where we were showing the difference in calibre between Rory Stewart, Florence of Arabia and Putin. But of course he has been a Bilderberger. He's been involved in the Bilderberg event. These are some of the other people who've been involved, anywhere from George Osborne to Mandy Mandelson and Richard Lambert, CBI and Bank of England, etc.
I was just going to say we shouldn't forget that when he went to Bilderberg, he of course claimed some expenses around that at the time. And if you remember, Brian, at the time he was refusing to acknowledge that he had any duty to inform his constituents of that.
Yeah, so you use public money, but when the public says, well, actually, what were you doing and discussing? Well, I'm not going to tell you that. So dual standards. But this is the sort of thing that we've paid attention. So here we've got the European Council on Foreign Relations, Security and Defence. Interesting logo for people who are interested in that sort of thing. Why Europe needs a new global strategy, briefing policy. And is Europe really a continent in decline? What sort of foreign policy can it have? That was in 2010. Well, it's certainly in decline. But here we've got Rory Stewart in the middle of this pack of people. So this man is for Europe, as you say. And this is the latest thing, that he actually was working for MI6. So now it gets even dirtier. So if we have a look at who this man is, well, we've listed all the things up to Turquoise Mountain. Now we're saying, is he former MI6? And let's not forget that he's been an educator of the royal family. So this man is something very, very special, but who knows exactly what he is. I don't think I would like him to be Prime Minister of the United Kingdom.
Yesterday Facebook launched its new global currency. Everybody will be glad to know about that. They called it an ambitious plan, and it's owned by Facebook. It's called Libra. It's owned by Facebook. They said that they're developing Libra. They're calling it a stable coin as opposed to a crypto coin. They want to get on the back of cryptocurrencies. They're calling it a stable coin. Because they say it's designed to avoid the volatility of Bitcoin and thus be useful for commerce. And they're doing this with some of the biggest names in payments and technology. So they're MasterCard, PayPal, Stripe, Visa, the eBay, Facebook themselves, Fartech, Lyft, Spotify, Uber, of course, Iliad, Vodafone, Bison Trails, Coinbase, Zappo Holdings, Venture Capital, Anderson Horowitz, Breakthrough Initiatives, Ribbit Capital, Thrive Capital, Union Square Ventures, people like Creative Destruction Lab, Kiva, Mercy Corps, Women's World Banking. So a mixture of hedge funds, banking, technology companies. Bitcoin, of course, attracting a lot of attention over in the last couple of years because of its volatility and the opportunities for speculation on that platform. Facebook, no, they are much more interested in actually building a global currency that people will actually use. What did Mark Carnage have to say about this? Well, he said, my mind is open. So his mind is open to it. On the other hand, Bruno Le Maire, he was not quite so happy. He said it's out of the question that Libra can become a sovereign currency. It can't and must not happen. He went on to say, this money will allow this company to assemble even more data, which only increases our determination to regulate the internet giants. So the Europeans, the EU, and France in particular, not so keen on this idea. I'd imagine there's a few other people not so keen on this idea. I think Facebook probably has a massive PR hurdle to get over to get this thing going. But on the other hand, with all the payment companies like PayPal and Stripe and so on, Visa, MasterCard behind it, maybe they have a better than no chance. I think a lot of people are going to be extremely concerned about the fact that, okay, payments could be made through WhatsApp and so on, but is Facebook going to be sharing that information? I think that's going to be of massive concern to people, but they definitely positioning this as a global currency, which is pan-national.
Right. And so what have we got? False protest here by the financial oligarchs, such as the French finance minister. It can't be allowed to happen. Is this part of theatre?
No, I think if you look at what the EU's done with the likes of Google and Microsoft and these big companies over the years, they have demonstrated some concern about some of their corporate globalist approaches to things. So I think the EU might step in and attempt to sort of put some limits on this. But of course, the EU is only one market. Okay, Facebook, Google, and so on aren't getting the opportunity to take part in the Chinese market, but there's Africa, South America, and other parts of Asia that would be gobbling this up.
Okay. Well, that's it for today. Thank you very much for joining us. If you're not already a subscriber of UK Column, please consider taking out a subscription and or making a donation. We can only do what we do with your financial support. And just a last note, thank you very much and well done to all the people who set up the Totnes event last night, which was starting to take the lid off the false green movement. Very interesting evening, and well done to all concerned. Thanks very much for joining us. We'll be back at the same time on Friday. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.